We're in a sermon series right now that is built upon the notion that God is a missionary God. And what I mean by that is that the God who made you and me did so with an agenda in mind. God not only made you and me with an agenda in mind, but He created this book with an agenda in mind. And not only did He create this book with an agenda in mind, and you and me with an agenda in mind, but He created the world with an agenda in mind. In other words, all things that have ever been made in creation serve a purpose that God intends. It's all moving somewhere. God has a mission. And sometimes in our churches, we will get into the mentality that we as a church need to have a missions department. And what I'm trying to say right now is, no, God has a mission, and the mission has a church. We get to be a part of what God is doing in the world. He's going somewhere, and I want to tap into that. I'm made to tap into that. You're made to be a part of that. And in fact, God has called us into this. We are a missionary people. It's not a component of what we do. It is quintessential to the existence of our being and of our church. We are a missionary people. There is a job that we've been called into as participants in God's agenda on the earth. We're a team that has embraced the gospel of Jesus Christ for ourselves, and we are now equipped with that gospel to go into the world and to make disciples. And so it's a gospel-centered discipleship mission that we are engaged in. A gospel-centered discipleship mission. That's what we're doing. And there's this question, if that's what we're called to do, and if we do in fact embrace the fact that we are God's plan for the advancement of His mission, if we embrace that, there's this question of what's that supposed to look like? If I embrace that I'm a missionary, and that may be a new concept for some of you. We tend to think of missionaries as the people who go off and do kind of the professional work while we stay here and, I don't know, fund it, maybe. But what I'm trying to say is, no, we are all missionaries. We've been sent to Fort Collins, Colorado. That we are here with the gospel, equipped with the gospel to make disciples of all nations. And there's this question of what's that supposed to look like? How do you live a life on mission? And our sermon series is entitled "A Life on Mission." And we're gonna spend about 3 or 4 more weeks talking about what it looks like to live out the missionary life in the everyday life of this world. So my friend Brian Howard, I've shared this with you already, but I just want to kind of make sure I'm giving credit where credit is due. My friend Brian Howard, I was talking with him about what we're trying to do in our church here as a church plant, and he said, well, in his church when he planted it long ago, there was this need to answer this question of what does it actually look like? Because when you tell people you're a missionary, who knows what comes to their minds, and that might actually seem overwhelming and kind of scary. So what's it actually look like? And Brian said, here, let me send you my sermon series. And so I looked at it and I took his notes and I basically just said, yep, I'm going to preach his sermons. So I'm not plagiarizing, I'm just lazy. No, I'm not. Maybe I am. He just did such a good job of sketching an outline. I'm just going to use it for the most part. So this is basically Brian's sermon in my own flavor, but I just want to give him credit, and so that nobody comes to me and is like, "Hey, I was looking on the internet and I recognized a sermon you preached once from another preacher that preached it way before you did." So, I'm just admitting that's what I'm doing. Okay, I've made that point. Our approach to the missionary calling is known as a missional approach. There are different tactics that churches and ministries have used throughout the years. the tactic we're using, the approach we're using is known as missional. And what that means is that our model of doing ministry is not that your job is to go out there and get people and bring them in here, and then since I'm the professional, I'll close the deal. That's not how we're thinking of it. We're not thinking of this as an event oriented ministry model. We do gather the people of God together, but we're not trying to put on the world's greatest event, and I'm not the professional. A missional approach is we gather the team together and we equip the team to be missionaries, and then you are involved in the work of ministry as well. The work of ministry isn't something that the professionals do. Ephesians chapter 4 says that the pastor's job in a church is to equip the saints for the work of ministry. The work of ministry is something that everybody is called into. And that means ministry to one another, and it means ministry to the lost. It means reaching out to people who don't know Jesus. And so a missional approach is one in which every person is equipped. And again, that might be new for you, so if it takes some time to sink in and work it out, then that's just fine. In fact, we're taking a whole sermon series to let it sink in and work out. We've talked about a few steps. In a missional approach, there are a few steps that have to be taken. And the first step is this. When you are wanting to live a life on mission, the mission and its success, its fruitfulness, requires us to go into and operate within this world. That's step one. You have to realize that our mission requires us to go into and operate within this world. Now, we don't operate within this world as materialistic hedonists, as though the things of this world are everything that we're living for. And at the same time, we don't withdraw from this world and create a Christian ghetto that is some pristine version of what humanity is supposed to be, and we just let the people out there, if they want to come in, they can come in, but we're staying clear. That's not how this works. Missionaries go in. They go into this world. They have to operate within this world, not as materialistic hedonists, but as participants in the creation. In God's common grace, we operate within society. We work jobs, we shop at grocery stores, we play on sports teams, our kids go to schools. We are living in this world, and God gets glory. God gets glory. Whether you eat or whether you drink or whatever you do it all to the glory of God in this world. And that's step number one. You have to get out of a seclusion mentality, and you have to get into a missionary mentality. Step number two is this. Our mission requires us to carefully watch how we live in this world. So yes, we go into this world, and then we carefully watch the way that we live in the world. We want to live like Christ-like people. We want to live in a Christ-like way. We want to be bearing fruit. Jesus talks about this in Matthew chapter 5. Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good works. Like, this is an important part of what's supposed to be happening in our lives as we live in this world. And we talked last week about when it comes to living in a Christ-like way and being people filled with good works, we want to make sure that we are people who are really committed to growing in love for people, to be compassionate people. We don't want to continue to be known as hateful, angry, chip on our shoulder, you're taking our country away from us, you prick, kind of people. And that's how people think of us. Because we lack, as a church, in compassion. We have to grow in love. And we have to keep growing in our commitment to holiness. Like, we got to care about stuff that's coming out of our lives that we're thinking, that's not what Christ-like people look like. So, step number one, we go into the world, and we got to operate there. Step number two, while we're there, we live in a Christ-like way. People of love and people who care about holiness. Not hypocrites, but people who care about holiness. Right? Step number 3, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Step number 3 is this. Our mission requires us to build purposeful relationships with unbelievers. Our mission requires us to build purposeful relationships with people who do not follow Jesus. They don't love him, they don't like him, they don't want to be around him, and we got to build friendships with them. We need to have friends who don't believe in Jesus. Because, and let me just give you kind of here's why practically this is important, and then we're going to go to some scriptures, and we're going to build a biblical foundation for this. But let me just kind of give you the reason why this is important. We have to build friendships because friendships is where you build trust with people. And trust is important for the success of this mission. And this is the reason why. Because without trust in this culture, in our post-Christian culture, and that's what we're living in right now. We do not live in a culture where the Judeo-Christian ethics that were once at the heart of society are at the heart any longer. Those mentalities that we hold dear are now on the margins. And it's happened on the coasts especially, and it's working its way in. This is just, we're just taking the path that Europe took. It's a post-Christian culture that we live in right now. And by the way, the mission is not to change it back to the way that it once was. That's not our mission. I'm just telling you that the mission field is such that we live in a place where you just cannot take it for granted any longer that people believe that there is such a thing as sin, that people believe that Jesus is Lord. That's not the norm any longer. And our job is to not fight a culture war so that people will agree with Fox News. That's not the job of the church. Without trust in that culture, without building relationships with people that trust you, it is very difficult to speak meaningfully to others about religious matters. This very private stuff. People don't want to talk about religious matters. And there are ways to speak about Jesus to people that aren't very meaningful because there's no trust. And people have done it for a long time in the United States. And actually in the United States, for a long time, it was fairly effective. You could do door-to-door evangelism, and it was fairly effective. Or at least somewhat effective. You could do street preaching, and it was somewhat effective. You could sell a vacuum cleaner door-to-door, and it was somewhat effective. It's not anymore. Right? We live in a culture of skeptics, and that method, as soon as you show up on the front doorstep, people are like, no way. As soon as they see you in Old Town with your sandwich board talking about how people are going to go to hell, which, by the way, I'm not saying that's not true. I'm just saying it's not effective communication because there's no trust. So people won't listen. They're not even hearing what you have to say. I was trying to give away free Chipotle on campus 2 weeks ago. And it was hard sometimes to get people to just... gift cards. $50 of gift cards for nothing. Well, you have to give me your contact info. Who do people tend to turn to when they need help or advice or input on spiritual matters? They tend to turn to people that they trust. Amy and I have friends in the neighborhood who will occasionally talk with Amy or me about parenting issues, about church, about scandal in their cult, about the gospel. Why? People who don't know Jesus, why do they talk to us? Because we're friends. That's why. It's not because I have a sign on my door that says, Pastor lives here, come, free counseling. We have relationship with these people, and they trust us. So if we want to be able to speak into people's lives effectively, we need to build relationships with them so that they trust us enough to speak about these very personal matters. Does that make sense? It's just like it's just a practical reason why relationships work for having meaningful discussions with people about Jesus. It's what allows people to just even be willing to listen to what you have to say on these matters, even if they disagree with you. Because of course they disagree with you. Right? Of course they don't believe what you believe on these issues. And they don't believe what the street preacher believes either. But who are they going to talk to? The street preacher or their friend? Right? That's the point I'm trying to make. Now, is it biblical? Is it biblical to make friends with people who don't know Jesus? Because there is no verse that says, go make friends with unbelievers for the sake of the mission. In fact, doesn't the Bible warn us against this kind of thing? Like, for example, 1 Corinthians 15:33, bad company ruins good morals. So doesn't the Bible kind of have some, hey, be careful type of instructions, warnings for us? I mean, if you've read the Proverbs and what Proverbs have to say to our kids about choosing their companions, there are some biblical principles that we need to talk about here. Is this biblical? So here's what I want to do. One, I want to give a biblical defense of this. And then secondly, I want to look at a few specific objections or how we handle these objections. Look at a few specific verses and say, okay, so how does this fit together with some of these verses that say, hey, be careful, beware. Let's build a biblical foundation first, though. And there are two strands that I want to use to set the foundation. The first one is this. Jesus modeled this in his own ministry. Jesus modeled being friends with people who were at war with God in his own ministry. He did this and showed us how to do it. And as we look at this, I want you to be mindful both of the actions of Jesus, and I'll try to point this out as well. I want you to be mindful of the heart of Jesus. What's driving him to do this? We're going to watch what he does, and then we're going to hear about why he does it. Jesus was known as a man who spent time with sinful people. He was thought of as the friend of those sinful people, and he was criticized by the religious establishment for it. Does that make sense? He was known for this. Luke 7:34, Jesus says, the Son of Man has come eating and drinking alcohol. And you say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard. That's where the drunkard comes from, right? That's where the gluttony charge comes from, and it's where the drunkard charge comes from. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, Pharisees, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Jesus' ministry was not mainly conducted in the safe walls of the Hilton-like Jewish synagogue. That's not mainly where Jesus did his work. He was known for spending lots of time with non-church kinds of people in their room doing their activities as one of their friends. Now, that does not mean that he was sinfully participating in their lifestyle. He was participating, but he was not sinfully participating in their lifestyle. But he was a part of things. He'd show up to a wedding and he'd bring the wine. I got blasted at Easter a few years ago because I brought a case of beer to the Easter dinner afterwards. Somebody was not happy about that. And I just think I was soaking in John 2 a little too much. He's criticized for being too involved with sinful people, a glutton and a drunkard and a friend, because he was eating and drinking and befriending sinners. he had a reputation for it. This was part of his regular rhythm in his lifestyle. And it came from situations like the wedding in Cana, and it came from situations like Luke 5:27 and following. You can feel free to turn there if you want to. Actually, why don't you turn there? Why don't you turn there? I'm kind of going through a bunch of verses, but we will park on this one for a little bit. Luke chapter 5. Jesus is out doing ministry, and he meets a man named Levi. And Levi is also known as Matthew, the author of the first gospel. Levi was a tax collector. And in Israel, under Roman authority, the tax collectors were people who were Jewish people. And the Romans had hired these Jewish people to collect taxes for Rome from the Jews. And the tax collectors, who were Jewish people hired by Rome to collect taxes from the Jews, the tax collectors were free to line their pockets. So they would charge, they'd say, here's how much you owe in taxes, and they would bump the number up, and then they'd just keep the surplus, and then they'd give Rome what Rome demanded. And so people hated the tax collectors because they had betrayed their own people, and they were thieves. They were robbing their own people. So, in Luke 5:27, after this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth where he was robbing people. And he said to him, "Follow me." And leaving everything, he rose and followed him. And Levi made Jesus, a great feast in his house. And there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining at table with him. So Jesus makes Levi a disciple, a follower. And Levi, in order to honor Jesus and the changed life that Jesus has now brought, Levi invites all of his friends, who are it's a totally sketchy crowd of tax collectors and other kinds of sinners. And so all of Levi's sketchy friends show up to this party, and Jesus is walking around with a red Solo cup because he's over 21, and he's eating some guacamole, and he's watching the Mayweather fight, right? He's just at the party with them. That's the kind of thing that Jesus did with people. He was always doing that kind of thing, and he was modeling a lifestyle of befriending people who don't walk with God. And he was deeply criticized by the religious establishment because of it. We'll read the rest of those verses in just a minute. Because it looks like Jesus is participating in the sketchiness when he does this. It looks like he's just indulging in the same sinful lifestyle and compromising his own holiness to be with these people. Now, this is a very messy way of doing things, isn't it? I mean, it would have been much cleaner if Jesus had just stayed in the synagogue and Paul called the people to come in. And if they don't come in, that's their problem, right? That would have been a lot cleaner way to do this. But if that were the attitude that Jesus had taken, then Levi would have never been saved. Because Levi was at the tax booth, robbing people. And that's where Jesus went to go save him. And in fact, if the attitude of Jesus was, let's stay in a safe place, and if they want to come in, they're welcome to, but I'm not going out there because that would make me dirty. If that were his attitude, he would have never come to earth in the first place. He would have never left the pristine realm of his throne room and taken on human flesh. Now, This sounds like it was kind of risky for Jesus to do this. And you better believe it was risky, because when Jesus took on flesh, he put himself in a situation where he was, we know from various gospel accounts, we know that for sure he was in direct, literal, satanic temptation as a result of putting himself in this situation. So it's messy. He's in temptation. He's in temptation from the devil. He's in temptation to take on the glory of the world. He's in temptation to avoid the cross. It's coming through Peter. I mean, he put himself in a troublesome kind of situation. It was very risky. Now, why did he do it? Why would he put himself at risk? Why would he spend time with people that could mean trouble? And his answer to it is, it's because they're sick and they need help. So if you go back to the rest of Luke 5, verse 30. After Jesus goes to Levi's house and watches the Mayweather fight, the Pharisees and their scribes grumbled at his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus answered them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." I have come to call sinners to repentance. I have come to call sinners to repentance. Why am I with the sinners? Because I have come to call sinners to repentance. That's why I'm here. I've got, me and my disciples are with them because they are sick and they need help. And that's where they are. So as a missionary, Jesus went to them and he befriended them because he came to call sinners. Now, what's the heart of Jesus? We can see his actions, but what's the heart? And the heart of Jesus is the same heart that brought him here in the first place. He has compassion for lost people. See, Jesus is not going to these parties so that he's got some excuse to kind of let loose and in the name of mission. He's going there because he has compassion for the lost. That's genuinely his desire. Which implies that we ought to do good heart check for ourselves too. Right? When we are engaging with people who don't love Jesus, do we really love them? Do we really love them? Are we doing it just for the sake of the mechanism of this is what our church is doing? Or do we love lost people? Do we love them? And I'm not condemning anybody for being just like I am. That is to say, lacking a lot of love for lost people. But I'm praying for it. I want to change. I want a heart of compassion for people who don't know Jesus. Jesus befriends people who are far from God. And in doing so, he models what he calls us to do. Now, here's the second strand of biblical evidence for what I'm trying to make the case for. I'm trying to make the case that we should be friends with people who don't know Jesus. And the first strand of biblical evidence is that Jesus did it. And the second strand is he told us to now go into their midst and to associate with them. He commanded us to do it. A couple places I want to point to. One is Matthew 5, verses 14 to 16. Matthew 5, you can turn there. Classic text. Classic text that I have read through several times and just blown right through many of the insights that are here. You are the light of the world, Christians. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket. They put it on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Jesus teaches us that our life of good works needs to exist in the presence of darkness. Two things from this verse that stand out to me. One is that your good works are a super important part of this equation. Let your light shine before others that they may see your good works. So we go into the places where people who don't love Jesus are. We befriend them, but we don't compromise our light when we do that. We don't compromise holiness. That's what we talked about last week. It's important to watch the way that you live. But here's the second thing. Those good works aren't supposed to stay in the safety of our Christian community, in the safety of our Christian gathering here at the Hilton. Those good works are intended to be visible to the world, because if our good works aren't visible to the world, because all we ever do is hang out with one another in private, then we have hidden our light under a basket. That's the imagery. Your salt has stayed in the salt shaker. It's not supposed to be that. Jesus explicitly commands us, don't put it under a basket. It needs to be public. It needs to be out there. Let your light shine before others. So live a holy life, but take a risk and do it in the presence of people who are in darkness. We are supposed to associate with people who are living ungodly lives. I'm going to say that again because it's really important. We are supposed to associate with people who are living ungodly lives. And I'm going to demonstrate it from a text in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. In fact, why don't you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 5? Because that's a very provocative statement. We are supposed to associate with people who live ungodly lives. And I'm not saying associate with them recklessly, and I'm not saying throw all caution to the wind. I'm saying keep a close watch on yourself and befriend unbelievers. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. Paul says to the Corinthians, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Not at all meaning, because the Corinthians had taken this the wrong way, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy and swindlers, or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world, because the world is full of them. But now I am writing you, to clarify, not to associate with anyone who bears the name brother, if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. So Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, and he said, there are certain people that you ought not associate with. And the Corinthian church mistakenly thought that he meant, don't hang out with people in the world who are ungodly. And what Paul is clarifying is that I did not mean that. I meant don't hang out with people who call themselves Christians and who will not turn from sin. This has to do with making sure that in the church, we are not okay with one another living in unrepentant sin, chasing each other's wives and spouses, and doing all sorts of stupid stuff that the Corinthians were doing. We're not supposed to just be okay with that happening, and we're all self-destructing, and we're just like, hope you make it. So the church has this responsibility to perform something known as church discipline. And that's a situation where if, after you make several attempts to try to get this person, like, please stop chasing this dude's wife. And if they will not do it, then there comes a point where a church actually has to say, I'm sorry, man, you call yourself a believer, but you're not acting like one. And we have to break fellowship with you. And that's kind of a last case scenario, and you do it in hopes that it will bring that person back into fellowship, that they'll be restored. We've had to do this. We had to do this a few years ago because there was a guy in our church who would not leave this other guy's wife alone. And they needed to stop. And Paul says, I don't want you to associate with those kinds of people in the church. Now, when it comes to people of the world who are doing the same kinds of things, it's a very different story. Because they don't call themselves followers of Jesus. Of course they're going to act this way. Of course they're going to be this way. Why wouldn't they? We were before we followed Jesus. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since you would need to go out of the world. In other words, you're not supposed to avoid associating with people in this world who are sexually immoral, greedy, swindlers, or idolaters. We are supposed to be in this world associating with those kinds of people in the hopes that they will come to Jesus and be saved. That's what the text says. And like Jesus, we're doing this because people are sick and they're in need of healing. And if we don't go to them, they'll never meet the great physician. I mean, the reason that you and I didn't go straight to heaven the second we believed in Jesus is because we are supposed to still be on mission, reaching out to people who don't know Jesus yet. Otherwise, take me home, you know? The patience of the Lord in not returning is because there are still people who aren't here this morning who don't know Jesus. And 2 Peter chapter 3 says the reason the Lord hasn't returned is because Jesus is patient with them, because he wants them to be saved. We're still here because they're not his yet. And we have a job to do. We have to go to be with them. Now, it would be a lot cleaner if we could just stay here in the Hilton and call people at Fort Collins, come in and join us. And if you don't come in, that's on you, not me. I mean, that would be a lot cleaner. And by the way, I love hanging out with one another. I love this community. So I'm not bashing that. All I'm saying is that if all we do is get together and we aren't incorporating into the rhythm of our life, bringing other people who don't know Jesus into that, or as teams going out to them, something's wrong. We're not living like missionaries. So our mission requires us to step out of the pristine environment of the church, and it's not all that pristine, by the way, but our job is to step out of the pristine environment of the church and into the mess of the world. Now, is it risky? You bet it's risky. It's totally risky to be a missionary. But whoever said that the Christian mission was going to be void of risk? You will not find a verse in the Bible that says that this mission is going to be void of risk. It's a high-stakes mission that requires close attentiveness to your own lifestyle, to your own heart, to your own motives, as you walk through a world filled with many dangers, toils, and snares for the sake of the fame of Jesus and the joy of those who don't know him yet. But welcome to the narrow road that leads to life. It's not a jaunt through the lilies. It's a race. And few take that path, and few find the life that it leads to. Because it's a race that has to be run with a cross on your back. It's a call to die to self, to go into the midst of these people, love them, and die to self. It's risky. But that's the nature of our mission. And don't be afraid, because even though it's impossible without God, with him we cannot fail. With him we cannot fail as we do this. Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far. and grace will lead me home, as the hymn goes. So what does it mean? It simply means that we should get to know and spend time with our neighbors, with our coworkers, with our fellow students, people that we're naturally rubbing shoulders with. We've talked a lot about our spheres of influence. What are your spheres of influence? Where do you live? Where do you work? Where do you play? And who are the people that you're naturally rubbing shoulders with, in relationship with? We should be getting to know those people. And this has to go beyond just kind of casual contact with those people. I'm talking about developing genuine, purposeful relationships with them. It's going to be hard. It's going to be messy. I've met some of your neighbors. It's going to be messy. I met a church planter from Denver Friday night. And their story is a really neat story. They've had a long, hard path. They're just trying to get traction. He moved his family into a low-income neighborhood in Denver. And there are a lot of gangbangers in this neighborhood. And so he made close friends with his next-door neighbor who had just gotten out of jail. The guy's got 5 cars. He parks them on the lawn that they share. There are several lowriders. And and he's like, this is our neighbor, this is our neighbor. We're going to share, they share lawnmowers, they eat together. This guy does not know Jesus, does not love Jesus. One day, and recently, because they've only been there for a year and a half, one day, this guy's the pastor's pulling out of his driveway, backing up, and he accidentally pulls out in front of this lowrider that swerves around him and cuts him off. The guy gets out of the car, comes up to him, starts pointing at him like this, and starts threatening to take his life. And starts threatening to take his family's life, who's standing there watching all of this happening. I'm coming back to get you. So he's like, why, I can't believe I moved into this neighborhood. So he goes to his next door neighbor and is like, hey, will you just watch my house today? I mean, this is I don't know, this is crazy. And the guy, who is also a gangbanger who just got out of jail, is like, wait, what did he say to you? And he kind of repeated the story. He's like, was that guy over there? Because the guy was still kind of in the neighborhood. He's like, okay. So he goes inside and gets his gun. And he comes back out. He's like, I'm going to make some phone calls. I'm going to walk around the neighborhood. You will never have to worry about this again. And he's like, wait, no. And he has to talk him out of making some phone calls. That's messy. But you know what this guy's perspective was? Do not mess with my pastor. And this guy doesn't go to church. But he loves this Christian that moved into the neighborhood and befriended him. At very high cost. I mean, a super risky, messy thing to be friends with people who don't love Jesus and live ungodly lives, like want to kill people. But it's not a jaunt through the lilies. That's a man living a life on mission. Now, I don't even know how long we've been going. Okay, some objections. What about all the be careful passages? And the first thing I would say to that, I got basically 2 things to say about it. The first thing is this. Be careful. When you sense danger, back away. You will find that there are certain people that as you try to get close to them, you're like, this is going to be big time trouble for me. And you should probably just back away. Find other people who don't love Jesus, that aren't going to create the same kind of dangerous situation for you. Use discretion. Don't put yourself in situations that you can just sense like, this is evil. This is evil, evil, evil. My wife and I have gone to plenty of parties with neighbors. We went to one party in particular a few years ago with some people that lived near to us. And we walked in, and I was like, there's something not good here. People are coming out of the bathroom at the same time, and there's people in the back hanging out with the kids, and I'm like, oh, what are they doing back there? This was like a yucky situation. Something about it was just wrong. They were wasted drunk. And we're like, okay, we gotta go. Use discretion, right? Team up together. You know, the disciples did their work in teams. Mike and I are playing softball together on this team. We're hanging out with people who don't love Jesus. It's cool that there are two of us there. It helps me live like a Christian. It helps Mike live like a Christian. It helps us team up and pray and strategize for these guys. I'm always trying to bring others with me as I'm trying to do stuff intentionally with people who don't know the Lord. Another thing when it comes to this idea of just be careful is that your closest friends should be Christians. Your closest friends should be people who share your fundamental value system about who runs the universe. Jesus was certainly friends with people who did not know God, but by far his closest companions were his disciples. By far. That was the crowd that he ran with. And I think this is what the Proverbs are getting at when it says, hey, be careful who you choose as your companions. I think it's talking about be careful who you choose to be like your closest inside crew. Proverbs 13:20. Whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. Or Proverbs 28:7. A companion of gluttons shames his father. Or this one's pretty obvious, Proverbs 29:3. A companion of prostitutes squanders his wealth. Now, Jesus was friends with fools. He was friends with gluttons, so much so that he was charged as being one. He was friends with prostitutes. Did he just ignore these verses? He just didn't care about those verses? Doesn't care if he makes his father out to be, if he shames his father. He doesn't care if he brings his life to harm. No. These verses are referring to something that's different than what we've been talking about. These verses are talking about watching the crowd that you run most intimately with, the crowd who is deeply influencing your convictions and your worldview. Be careful who your closest friends are. They will steer you one way or the other, and you have to be very mindful of that. But that doesn't mean you can't have some type of purposeful friendship relationship with people who don't know Jesus, and in fact, you should. Here's the second thing I would say about these be careful verses, and it would be make sure you're reading them accurately. Read the context. Do a little bit of study, because sometimes these passages look like they're saying something that they're not actually saying. Sometimes it looks like it's saying don't associate with unbelievers. It's just not what they're saying. So, for example, 1 Corinthians 15:33, do not be deceived. This is the one that I read to you earlier in the sermon. Do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals. It's very important to understand that in 1 Corinthians 15, the context, Paul is talking about false teachers in the church who are denying the resurrection. And he's saying, stop hanging out with them. Because bad company will ruin you. False teachers who deny the resurrection will do bad things to you, church. So, steer clear. Or here's another example, James 4:4. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy with God. I mean, that sounds pretty much like we ought to huddle up and just not talk to people who don't know Jesus. The context, however, makes it very clear that what you're dealing with here are quarrels in the church that are the result of people having idolatrous passions. And so, Do not be a friend of the world in the sense that we ought not to live as though the things of the world here and now are ultimate for us. Those idolatrous passions that are destroying the church are what Paul's addressing here. He's not saying don't invite Mark to the picnic unless you want to be at war with God. That's not what it's saying. Or 1 John 2:15, if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Does that mean don't love your neighbor? Because if it did, it would contradict Jesus' clear commandment, love your neighbor. And the fact that John 3:16 says that God loves the world. So you just have to be careful that you're reading those texts correctly. Not everything is what it seems at first glance. So in conclusion, let's take Jesus as our model. Let's be the friends of sinners. Let's take the risk. Let's face the messiness. Reach out. Try to get to know some people who are lost. Yes, be careful. Know who your closest teammates are. People who are committed to our mission. People who reinforce our commitment to Jesus. But that should not imply that we are to be aloof from those that we are called to reach out to.